Hi there, it's Angharad, Curator at Creswell Crags here, just to say that the video that follows was a fun festive talk that we originally presented and recorded in December of 2021. So if you're interested in more talks on similar themes like archaeology and paleontology, please do check out our Patreon page and I'll put a link to that below. And becoming a Patreon member really does help support Creswell Crags and allows us to continue our online talk series. So we are so grateful to all of our Patreon members, and of course we are so grateful to all of you out there who support Creswell Crags in whatever way you can. Thank you.
So today I'm going to be talking about the 12 Days of Christmas, the Ice Age version. So really this is just a bit of fun. I'm going to be dissecting the 12 Days of Christmas, sort of sorting out which elements within the song would have been around in the Ice Age and which wouldn't, and we're going to be creating our own Ice Age version at the end. So as I said, it's a bit of fun, so it's not an exhaustive academic overview of every single element of the 12 Days of Christmas. So it's sort of I've got quite a lot of different topics to talk about today, so I'm going to be quite brief in most of them. Okay, so the 12 Days of Christmas. So I'm a paleontologist. I'm not a historian. I'm not a Christmas carol expert. But I just wanted to give a brief overview of what the 12 Days of Christmas is. So I'm sure most, if not all of you, are very familiar with the song, The 12 Days of Christmas. So it was written, or at least published, in 1780 in a book called Mirth Without Mischief. And you can see the cover here. So if you look on a website called the Internet Archive, you can actually find this book, Mirth Without Mischief. And you can see the original published version of the 12 Days of Christmas. And you can see here, it's got other things as well as the 12 Days of Christmas. It's got Nimble Ned's alphabet and figures, and something about love and hatred, which is interesting. But here you can see the very start of the 12 Days of Christmas song. So you've got your partridge in a pear tree. And you'll see throughout the talk that I've actually included these original illustrations on some of the pages, because I thought that was quite nice to include the original 1780s illustrations. But it wasn't until 1909, so over a century after the original words were published, that the musical tune that is most familiar to us was created. But there have actually been lots of other variations in tunes and lyrics, some of which I'm going to be outlining today. And indeed, the original order was slightly different than we know it today. So the original song, the original 12 Days of Christmas, published in 1780, had all these elements. So the drummer's drumming and the partridge in a pear tree and everything in between, but some of them were a bit mixed up, a bit in a different order. And if you count the elements in the images that you'll see along their talk, you might be able to see which ones were in a slightly different order. Okay, so our Ice Age version. So most of you might know what the Ice Age is, because I can tell that we've had quite a few people who have been to our previous talks and probably heard this spiel before, but just in case, just to go over what the Ice Age is. So the Ice Age is a common term really for the Pleistocene. So the Pleistocene began 2.6 million years ago and ended 11.7 thousand years ago. And it was a period not completely cold, so it was a period of fluctuating cold and warm conditions, so fluctuating glacial and interglacial conditions. And within those glacials and interglacials, there were smaller fluctuations in temperature as well. So these two images here are two artists' interpretations of what Creswell Crags looked like at two different points in the Pleistocene. So on the right-hand side, we have what might be sort of the stereotypical Ice Age landscape view. So very snowy, very cold, quite barren in terms of vegetation. On the right-hand side, we've got a little fire, and that would be, that's indicating people sort of sheltering in the entrance of one of the caves. But on the left-hand side here is another view of what Creswell Crags looked like in the Pleistocene. So this was 125,000 years ago. So the last interglacial or warm period before the warm period we're in today. So as you can see, there's a lot more trees and there's some animals hanging around as well. Okay, so we'll start then. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each sort of line in the 12 Days of Christmas in turn, assess whether we could have had these elements in the Ice Age, and make some suggestions of some alternatives that we'll include in our version at the end. So to start with, partridges and pear trees. So lovely image of a partridge there. Did we have partridges in Ice Age Europe? So I forgot to say that I'm going to be focusing just on Europe, because trying to work with the Ice Age of the entire world would be a bit much for one talk. So just 12 Days of Christmas in Ice Age Europe. So did the partridge live in Ice Age Europe? So I did find some mention in a couple of papers, but I couldn't actually find any specific sites where partridges had been found. And most of the papers that I found seemed to pertain to the DNA of modern partridges. So actually, I'm not quite sure how good the evidence is of partridges in Pleistocene Europe. And what about the pear? So I conducted a literature search for the pear. So I wasn't looking for the domestic pear. I was looking for any species within the genus Pyrus, which is the genus that pears are in. And there was only one potential mention of Pyrus species in Pleistocene Europe. But when I dug a bit deeper and tried to then look into the citation or the reference that that paper had cited, I couldn't actually find any mention of pears in Europe during the Pleistocene. And actually the closest I could find, I think, was Azerbaijan. So I think we're going to have to find something different. So we can't have partridges and we can't have pear trees. So what could we have in our 12 Days of Christmas song? So I'm going to mention a few times this assemblage of fossil birds found in Pinhole. So Pinhole is one of the caves in Creswell Crags. And quite unusually for Britain, it has a really good assemblage of Ice Age birds. So a really good Ice Age bird record. And I say this is quite unusual. I think there's potentially a couple of reasons for this, but I think the main one might have been because a lot of the caves in Britain were excavated during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And many of the excavators weren't the best at being very systematic in how they excavated caves. And a lot of them also tended to pick out their favourite bits, and those tended to be the larger mammals, such as the woolly rhinoceros and woolly mammoth or the brown bear. So there aren't many, as far as I'm aware, there aren't many really good Pleistocene bird records in Britain. But we do have this good one in Pinhole. So I had a look at the birds that were cited in this paper that was written by Stewart and Jacobi in 2015. And the partridge is in the family Phasianidae. And there were two species of birds within the family Phasianidae that were found in Pinhole, and they were the rock and the willow ptarmigan. So I think ptarmigan can be our candidate species for the very first line in our 12 Days of Christmas song. But what about an alternative to the pear tree? So in terms of understanding what vegetation was like in the past, there's many different ways that we can reconstruct vegetation. And this includes things like pollen or plant macrofossils, such as seeds and parts of leaves. And the reason why we can look at pollen is because different families or genus or species of plants produce pollen that has different morphologies. So for example, this one on the image here is, I think it's pine pollen, and it's got two air sacs on either side. And these pollen or these plant macrofossils can be found in various different environments, and these include sediment cores such as lakes and bogs, the coprolites, so fossilized poo of animals such as the hyena, or even remains of plants in animals' teeth. So in Pinhole again, if we just go back to Pinhole, Pinhole was used as a hyena den, and as well as the remains of the hyenas, they had the remains of the hyena coprolites. And I think it was Lewis in 2011 published a study looking at the pollen found in the hyena coprolites. And they found that there was 99% non-arboreal, so non-tree pollen found within this hyena coprolite. So this indicated a largely open grassland environment, which obviously isn't quite what we want for our song. We want an alternative to pear tree. We can't really have a bird perching on a blade of grass. The 1% tree pollen was willow. So during the Pleistocene, as I said, there were fluctuations in climate. There were cold and warm periods, and the vegetation varied in response to these changes in climate. So one of the classic environments was the mammoth steppe, so the really productive open steppe grassland, and that is indicated by the pollen found within the hyena coprolite. But during interglacials, warm periods, in some places in Britain, there tended to be more tree species around. So one example of this is Barrington in Cambridgeshire. So this is a site from the last that has sediments preserved from the last interglacial. And they found that although there was quite a lot of tree species, there was a bit of grassland, mainly around the river, due to trampling of the vegetation by large mammal species such as the hippopotamus. But then if we go back to tree species, the species that were found in Barrington included oak and pine, in addition to alder and elm and some birch and hazel. So I think looking at those tree species, I think pine might be a good one for our songs, maybe a ptarmigan in a pine tree. So that's our first line of the song out the way. Okay. And now we have turtle doves. So today the European turtle dove has a wide range, which includes most of Europe, except for parts of Scandinavia and Scotland, and also some areas of Central Asia, and also some areas of Northern Africa, and sort of a band within sort of Central-ish Africa, sort of Senegal, Northern Nigeria, and Southern Sudan area. But was there any evidence of turtle doves from Pleistocene Europe? So I did find some evidence from southern Italy, including Sicily, from the middle of the Ice Age, sorry. But thinking a bit closer to home, thinking back to that pinhole assemblage. So the turtle doves are in the order Columbiformes, and there was a species found in pinhole from the Columbiformes, and that was the wood pigeon. So I know wood pigeon is probably not the most popular of birds, but I quite like it. So I think for our second line in the song, we'll have the wood pigeon. So we'll have two wood pigeons. Okay, and now we're on to French hens. So there's a lot of birds. So we think about French hens. So I honestly wasn't really sure what was meant by French hens. So I did do a bit of research, and I found an article written in the American Ornithological Society by Bob Montgomery. And he suggested that there were a couple of French birds, French breeds of hens or chickens that were popular when the 12 Days of Christmas was written. And this included Bresse Galloise, I apologize for the pronunciation, and La Flèche. And these were at the time really sought after as food. Okay, so could we have had chickens in Pleistocene Europe? So chicken domestication happened after the Ice Age. So they are thought to have been domesticated from the red jungle fowl, which is native to areas of Southeast Asia. And I was looking for whether there was any evidence of wild chickens or anything within the genus Gallus in Europe. And there was a paper by Stewart written in 2005. And he mentioned that there were some potential finds of Gallus in Europe, but actually these needed reviewing, and they potentially might have been intrusions of more modern material, so material from after the Ice Age. And indeed, an example of this is a site called Hoyovipustek in the Czech Republic. So this was a hyena den during the Pleistocene. But when they excavated the cave, they found that along with the hyenas and their prey, they found domesticated chicken. So bearing in mind, this would have been at least 30,000 years ago, probably older. the domestic chicken would have been an intrusive element within that deposit. And this might have occurred through maybe instability in the sediments, through mixing via water, or through mixing via a burrowing animal. So if we can't have the domestic chicken, what other animals could we have? What other birds were used for food in the Pleistocene in Europe? So I looked at a paper by Blasco and Fernandez Perez, written in 2012, and they were talking about Bollamore Cave in Iberia. And within that cave, there was a lot of small animal prey found. So this included the rabbit, the tortoise, and various bird species. And they inferred that the deposit was accumulated largely by humans, partly because of the lack of carnivore damage. So there wasn't any carnivore tooth marks, carnivore gnawing, indicating that carnivores had accumulated those bones for food. They also found the presence of cut marks, some burning, and some human tooth marks, all of which suggested that these animals had accumulated because humans were using them, at least in part, for food. So these bird species included pigeons, the mute swan, and species of diving duck, such as these two here. So I think diving duck is quite a nice alliterative one to have in our 12 Days of Christmas version. Okay, so more birds. So the calling bird. So I wasn't sure what was meant by the calling bird. I did think maybe it was just a songbird. But when I looked into this, apparently there were some variations of the song that used different words other than calling bird. So one of them was the collie bird, which is essentially just a blackbird. And then other versions included the canary bird. So I did originally think that maybe canary bird was used because canaries were used in collieries. But apparently they weren't used in coal mines or collieries in Britain until 1911, well after the original 12 Days of Christmas was written, and also after the sort of the tune as we know it today was produced. So maybe it was just a mishearing of the word calling or collie. They decided to use canary instead. So I had a look to see if there was any evidence of blackbirds in Pleistocene Europe. And if we think back again to that pinhole assemblage, there was evidence of a genus, Turdus. Okay, they couldn't identify the bones to species, they could only identify it to the genus. So within the Turdus genus, there are blackbirds, but there are also other species, such as thrushes. So I thought, instead of blackbirds and canaries, what other birds could we have? And I thought about, there was a really cool site called Grotta di Fiumane in Italy. And I thought about that because recently, some of you might have been to it, but recently we did sort of a behind the scenes joint museum tour with Creswell Crags, Grotta di Fiumane, and the Neanderthal Museum in Germany. And they have a really high concentration of bird remains. So there was a paper published that looked at the bird remains accumulated by Neanderthals. And it was quite interesting because a lot of the birds that were accumulated weren't actually suitable for consumption, really. And they found the cut marks on elements, so bones, different bones, that were in areas where you wouldn't really find much meat. So they thought maybe the cut marks were to remove feathers from the animals, from the birds. And this was confirmed through an experimental archaeology, I believe, when they did actually experiment in cutting feathers off a bird. And they determined that maybe the feathers were being used for decoration. So the species that they, two of the species that they found were the bearded vulture and the red-footed falcon. So I think either of these two species are slightly more interesting than the canary to include in a 12 Days of Christmas and to receive as a present, slightly more terrifying as well. So I think we'll go for the bearded vulture for our version. Okay, gold rings. So you might think, yes, we've got away from the birds, there's something different. But some people apparently think that the gold rings actually refer to the rings on a bird's neck. Although I'm not 100% sure on this, because this image in the middle here is from the original 1780 version of the 12 Days of Christmas, and it very obviously shows rings as in jewelry, not rings around a bird's neck. So unless the illustrator didn't speak to the writer of the song, I'm not really sure. But we've had enough birds, I think, so we'll stick to jewelry to be able to talk about something different. So although gold has been found in a few Paleolithic deposits and caves, it was only really after the Ice Age where there was evidence of gold being deliberately used. Although, I mean, this isn't my area of expertise at all. I'm firmly within the Ice Age in terms of my background, but apparently there was some debate about where and when the first purposeful use of gold occurred. But what about other jewellery? What about jewellery that might have been found in the Ice Age of Europe? So I'm going to talk a little bit about a really famous burial called the Red Lady of Paviland. So Paviland, Goat's Hole Paviland, is in Wales. And the Red Lady actually isn't a lady. I think based on the morphology of bones, the consensus is that it's most likely a male. But it is a really quite famous Ice Age burial, and along with the human has been found a lot of different artifacts. And some of these have been termed ivory bracelets, although the authors of the study actually determined that maybe they weren't actually used as bracelets because they weren't found on the wrists or around the ankles of this individual. But another thing that was found was perforated periwinkle shells. So these are just images that I found of periwinkle shells. Unfortunately, because of copyright, some of the images that I wanted to include, I wasn't able to. But they found a lot of periwinkle shells that had been purposely perforated. And they suggested that these might have been strung together or used as decoration or used as beads. So not 100% used as jewelry, but I think perforated periwinkle shells is quite a nice one to include in our song as an alternative to gold rings. But I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you'd prefer periwinkle shells or a gold ring for Christmas. Okay, back to birds for a second. So we've got geese here. So was there any evidence of geese in Pleistocene Europe? And the answer is yes. So quite a few different species. Two of the species included the lesser white-footed goose and the barnacle goose. And they were found in various different areas, such as El Castillo and also Romanelli. And they were found in areas more southern than they're generally found today, apparently. But I'm going to say sorry to the birds, but I think we've maybe had enough birds so far in our song. I think maybe we'll have a look at some of the other animals. So what other animals lived in Europe during the Pleistocene? So we'll return to Creswell Crags for just a second and look at the mammal species that lived in Creswell Crags during two different periods of the Pleistocene. So on the left-hand side here is this image you've already seen before. So this image from the last interglacial or warm period, 125,000 years ago. And species that lived here at the time were the hippopotamus that you can see there in the lake. On the left-hand side, you can see some narrow-nosed rhinoceroses. There were hyenas, there were giant deer, cave bear and brown bear. And then on the right-hand side, we've got an image from the middle of the last glacial period. So quite cool conditions, but not full glacial conditions. So you can see some animals here again. So again, we've got the hyena, we had wolf, we had reindeer and horse, woolly rhinoceros. But I think the classic animal of the Ice Age is obviously the woolly mammoth. And I think I'd be remiss if I created a song about the Ice Age without including the woolly mammoth in it. So I think that's going to have to go in our song to replace the geese. Okay, so more birds again. So we've got swans now. So swans have also been found in deposits dating to the Ice Age in Europe. So one of these is a musical instrument made from a swan radius, so an arm bone of a swan that was found in the Swabian Jura in Germany. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later in more detail. And they were also found in the assemblage that I spoke about earlier from Bollamore Cave in Iberia. But again, we've maybe had enough of the birds. So what other animal could we have? So I think this was, yeah, 7 swans are swimming. So we're going to have to stick to alliteration or sibilance. So what animals beginning with S could we have had that lived in the Pleistocene of Europe? So the first one I'm going to suggest is the narrow-nosed rhinoceros. So obviously that doesn't begin with S, but the Latin name is Stephanophrys hemitoecius. And this was present during the warmer periods of the Pleistocene in Britain. So if you remember that image from Creswell Crags a couple of slides before, that was hanging around by the edge of the water. But much as I do like the narrow-nosed rhinoceros, I think saying Stephanophrys hemitoecius in a song will get people tongue-tied. It will get me tongue-tied. So sorry, narrow-nosed rhinoceros. Another animal, which I'm going to include because I quite like the look of it, is a saiga antelope. So today, the saiga antelope is actually really endangered, and it's found in the Central Asian steppe areas. But it did have a much wider area, including Europe. And it had quite an interesting dietary story as well. So Jurgensen looked at the isotopes, so the carbon and nitrogen isotopes found in the teeth of the saiga antelope, and the carbon and nitrogen isotopes can tell us about the past diet of an animal. And they found that while they had a diet of grazing in the Pleistocene, such as they do today, at some points they were also able to adapt their diet to consume lichen, which is sort of the diet that reindeer have today. And then our last species that I'm going to suggest is the shrew. So if you've been to any of our past talks, you'll know that I have a bit of a soft spot for the small mammals because they've been traditionally neglected. As I said, some of the earlier excavators were not great at preserving the smaller items, partly because they didn't really sieve very well or sieve at all, and partly because they didn't really care about them. So I think I'm going to have to include the shrew in our 12 Days of Christmas song, just so the small mammals can represent. So today the common shrew lives as far north as Lapland, and it can tolerate deep snow. And shrew teeth are really quite a nice ones to have in our Pleistocene deposits. So if you've got a really rich deposit of sediment, you've got a bag of sort of small sediment, and there's loads and loads of animal teeth and bones, and you've got to pick out and identify through a microscope. The shrew is actually a nice one to find because some shrew species have teeth which have red tips. So that stands out really nicely from the deposits that you're picking through. And these tips are, I believe, iron oxide, which strengthens the cusp of the tooth, which means that they're less susceptible to erosion from the foods that they eat. Okay, so now we're getting into slightly trickier territory, and we're getting into the lines of the song that include humans. So maids and milking. So cows were domesticated from aurochs, but this was after the Ice Age. And Dr. Lizzie Wright from the University of Nottingham actually recently gave a really good talk discussing the origins of the cow and the domestication of the cow. So I won't go into too much detail about that. But aurochs were, well, I mean, as wild sort of cattle are today, quite dangerous. So I cannot see Pleistocene humans really trying to milk an aurochs. So I'm afraid we're going to have to get rid of maids and milking from our song. But how else did humans get food? So you've probably heard of the phrase hunter-gatherers. So humans, and not just modern humans, but other human species as well, were hunting and gathering for their food. So there's much evidence of consumption of animals, including cut marks on bones. So I've got an image here, and I've highlighted the cut marks in black, and also isotopes as well. And they help to tell researchers what humans were consuming at different times in the past. So just as an example, in Britain, modern humans in the late Pleistocene were consuming a wide variety of species, including horse, red deer, aurochs, mountain hare, and also potentially reindeer. Sorry, Rudolph. And in addition to other species such as freshwater fish and marine resources. So that's the hunting side of things, but what about the gathering? So evidence of plant consumption can come from a thing called dental calculus. So that's sort of like the tartar that is preserved on teeth. And within this tartar or dental calculus, there's particles within there, such as starch grains and phytoliths, which are like silica. And I've got an image here on the right-hand side of some phytoliths. And they preserve a record of the plants put in the mouth. So it might not necessarily be plants that were eaten. Plants might have been put in the mouth for other reasons, such as working for various tools or whatever. But a couple of studies that I'm just going to mention. So Spy Cave or Spee Cave in Belgium had remains of Neanderthals found in there. So Amanda Henry and colleagues in 2011 looked at the starch found in the dental calculus of the Neanderthal teeth, and they found evidence of grasses. So these included a genus which included edible cereals. And then various studies of the dental calculus of humans, Homo sapiens, have been conducted in Europe. And plant consumption included various grasses again, also juniper fruits and hazelnuts as well. So I think instead of maids and milking, we'll have humans hunting and or gathering in our song. And the next one then, even trickier, is ladies and dancing. So was there any evidence of humans dancing in the Pleistocene of Europe? And I'm going to go sort of for that. I'm going to say sort of. So I've looked at one paper, which I'm going to talk about here because it was published this year and it was really, really interesting. So it was by Mayoral and colleagues, and they looked at 87 Neanderthal footprints that were found on a beach in the Iberian Peninsula. So what they did first of all was they compared the footprints to those of other known Neanderthal footprints to assess whether these actually did belong to Neanderthals, and they concluded that yes, they were. And also on the site, there were some lithics, so some stone tools that were potentially Mousterian. So Mousterian was a technology that was largely produced by Neanderthals. So that also adds weight. And they also looked at physical remains of Neanderthal bones, foot bones, to try and determine the ages of the individuals that made these footprints. And it seemed to be sort of a mixed group, including adults, adolescents, and children. And actually, children are largely ignored in Paleolithic studies. Although next year we do have a talk by a researcher called April Nowell talking about Pleistocene children, which I'm really excited about. But there was, so the paper was published this year, but there was another element of information that wasn't included in the scientific paper, but was included in an article in Life Science. So one of the researchers of the paper was quoted, and they said that the smallest footprints found potentially belonged to a child of possibly around 6 years of age. And they said that the chaotic nature of these footprints potentially indicated that the child was playing in this area, which I thought was quite nice. So whether this playing is dancing or not, we don't know. But I think Neanderthals playing it is quite a nice one to include in our song. Okay. So next we've got lords and leaping. So I'll say that leaping is probably a bit too close to dancing and playing. So I'm going to move away from humans for this one and think about what other species that lived in Pleistocene Europe might have leapt or jumped. And there were probably some insects, but if we think about the mammals, a classic one is the hare. So mountain hares have been found in various deposits and have been found in Creswell Crags. So there's this image again of the cut-marked bones. This is the proximal area of a humerus, so the upper area of your upper arm bone. And this was found in Robin Hood Cave, but other cut-marked hare bones have been found in Creswell Crags. And this indicated usage of the carcass by modern humans, and it's likely that one of the usages of the carcass was as food. And this specimen here has been dated, and this has been dated to around 15,000 to 14,300 years ago. So during the glacial period. And in addition to cut marked bones, tools have also been found. So this is a bone awl from Churchill, which is another cave in Creswell Crags. I think this might have been a tibia of a mountain hare. So this might have been used for sort of making holes in items. So I think hopping hares might be a good alliterative species to include in our song. Okay, pipers and piping. So while there isn't really, as far as I can tell, much mention of pipes from the Pleistocene in Europe, we do have quite a lot of mentions of flutes. So on the left-hand side here, I've got an image of a flute from Slovenia. And the reason that I've included flute in quotation marks is because it's actually fairly contested about whether it's a true flute or not. So if it was real, it was made by Neanderthals and has been dated to around 40,000 years ago. So some people say that these holes that you can see here were created purposefully by Neanderthals in order to create an instrument. However, other people suggest that these holes might have been created by carnivores. And indeed here at the bottom, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but at the bottom, it's sort of quite rounded and smooth, which is fairly characteristic of hyena gnawing. But I think people are still debating this. But then if we move on to a bit later, we've got a really good assemblage of finds from the Swabian Jura in Germany. So these include quite a lot of art, so art carvings on items, but also quite a few musical instruments. So Conrad and colleagues in 2009 looked at some musical instruments from a site called Hoyfels in the Swabian Jura. And they talked about a radius of a griffin vulture that had been turned into a flute and that had 5 finger holes. And then that radius of a swan that I talked about earlier that had 3 finger holes. So those were made by the bones of birds, but flutes were also crafted from ivory. And I'm just going to read this quote from Conrad and colleagues detailing the construction of ivory flutes, because it's absolutely incredible. And I just want to read this to you so you know just how amazing this construction was. So they said the technology for making an ivory flute is much more complicated than that for making a flute from a bird bone. It requires forming the rough shape along the long axis of a naturally curved piece of mammoth ivory, then splitting it open at the interface of the cementum and the dentine or along one of the other bedding planes in the ivory, then carefully hollowing out the halves, then carving the holes, and then finally rejoining the halves of the flute and making sure that the seals are airtight. And that just sounds incredible. There's so many steps to creating a flute from ivory. And it's just amazing. It's just amazing to me how it was created, and the fact that they were able to make these seals airtight to be able to then play the flute to create some beautiful music. Okay, so flutes, I think, needs to be in our final version. Okay, and then drummers and drumming. So drums is a difficult one. I did try and find whether there was evidence of Paleolithic drums in Europe. And I couldn't really find much evidence, which isn't surprising really, because the drums would likely have been made from wood and from animal skins. And these sort of things don't really preserve as well as bones and teeth. And I was thinking, what could we have instead? And we've already had musical instruments. We've had birds and mammals and plants and hunting and gathering and playing around. What other important things relating to the Ice Age have we missed out so far that we should include in our song? So one of the classic things is tool creation. So we've included the hair awl, but one thing we haven't mentioned is the creation of lithics, such as through flint snapping. And a second thing that we haven't really mentioned is art. So I said in the Swabian Jura in Germany, there's lots of examples of art carved into items, so like carved out of ivory or bone. And also there's rock art. So you might know that Creswell Crags, Church Hole in Creswell Crags has evidence of engraved rock art. Also, there's cave paintings elsewhere as well. So I recently gave a talk where I spoke a bit about the cave paintings in Indonesia, but of course there's lots of cave paintings in Europe as well. So I've just included this really lovely image here from Lascaux. So Lascaux is in the Dordogne region of France, and there's some engravings in Lascaux, but there's also lots and lots of paintings, like an incredible number of paintings. And there's loads of different animals that were included as well. And these include lots of species such as horses, red deer, bison, bear, and rhinoceros. And I think because we need alliteration, so instead of drummers drumming, I think we need painters painting. So that's the final one that's going to be included in our version. Okay, so here is our Ice Age version. So on the 12th day of Christmas, my clanmate gave to me, I'm not going to sing, by the way, because I might make you cry because I'm a terrible singer. 12 painters painting, 11 flautists fluting, 10 hares a hopping, 9 Neanderthals playing, 8 humans hunting or gathering, 7 shrews a snuffling, 6 mammoths munching, 5 perforated periwinkle shells, 4 bearded vultures, 3 tufted ducks, 2 wood pigeons, and a ptarmigan in a pine tree. So I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you would have preferred to receive the gifts from the original 12 Days of Christmas, or whether you would prefer to receive all these gifts as Christmas presents. So just finally, thank you for watching. This was honestly just a bit of fun. As I said, I wasn't going to give an exhaustive overview of any of these elements because I could have gone on all night about it, and I'm sure you got better things to do. But we did have a bit of a journey, didn't we? We talked about birds and mammals, musical instruments, artwork, movement, food procurement, and jewelry, and a bit of domestication as well. So thank you so much for watching.